The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Pacific waters like a blade through silk, its massive nuclear-powered hull displacing thousands of tons of ocean as it made its way back to Naval Base Kitsap. Seaman recruit Tyler Jennings stood on the hangar deck, his crisp new uniform still stiff with that fresh-from-the-package fact feel, watching the other sailors move around him with the practiced efficiency of people who actually knew what they were doing. He'd been on the carrier for exactly 3 weeks and thought he had the whole Navy thing figured out. The brass loved his test scores from boot camp, his superiors nodded approvingly at his quick responses during drills, and he'd already memorized more technical manuals than half the second-year sailors. Pride swelled in his chest every time someone called him by his rank, and he walked the narrow corridors with the confidence of someone who believed natural talent could replace years of experience. That confidence was about to cost him everything. An old man in faded blue coveralls shuffled past Tyler with a mop bucket, moving so slowly that Tyler had to sidestep to avoid him. The man's silver hair was cropped military short, and his weathered face was mapped with deep lines that spoke of decades spent in harsh conditions. His name tag read Walsh in letters so worn they were barely visible. Tyler didn't even glance at him twice because janitors weren't worth noticing, not when you were destined for officer training like he was. The old man's eyes flickered toward Tyler for just a moment, taking in the crisp uniform and the arrogant set of his shoulders, before returning to his mop with the kind of patient resignation that comes from being invisible for too long. Below deck in the reactor spaces, the real heart of the carrier beat with controlled nuclear fury, a testament to engineering that most sailors would never see or understand. Tyler had been down there once during his orientation tour, listening to Chief Engineer Martinez drone on about coolant systems and control rods, but he'd been too busy imagining his future command to pay much attention to the details. He remembered thinking how simple it all seemed when you broke it down to basics, just like the diagrams in his manual. Walsh had been there too that day, quietly checking gauges in the background while Martinez lectured, but Tyler hadn't noticed him then either. The carrier was scheduled to undergo routine maintenance at Kitsap, a standard procedure that happened every few months to keep the floating city of 5,000 souls running smoothly. The mood on board was relaxed, almost jovial, as sailors anticipated shore leave and the chance to sleep in beds that didn't rock with the ocean's rhythm. Tyler had plans to visit Seattle, maybe find a bar where he could talk about his service to impressed civilians who'd buy him drinks and listen to his stories about life at sea. He'd already practiced a few good ones in his head, carefully editing out the parts where he didn't know what he was doing and emphasizing the moments that made him sound heroic. Walsh finished mopping his section of deck and pushed his bucket toward the storage closet, his movements economical and precise despite his apparent age. Nobody thanked him, nobody acknowledged his work, and he didn't seem to expect them to, his existence on the carrier as background as the hum of the ventilation systems. It started at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning when most of the crew was asleep in their racks, dreaming of home or shore leave or whatever sailors dream about when they're 3 weeks into a deployment. The first alarm was a low warning tone that most people ignored because alarms went off all the time on a carrier, usually for drills or minor system hiccups that the engineering teams handled before anyone else even woke up. But this alarm didn't stop. It was joined by a second one 30 seconds later, then a third, and then suddenly the entire reactor control room was screaming with warning klaxons that sent the night shift scrambling to their stations with sleep still crusting their eyes. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was the watch officer on duty, a by-the-book officer who'd graduated top of her class at Annapolis and spent the last 6 years working her way up through the engineering department with meticulous attention to protocol. She reached the control room in under 2 minutes, her uniform hastily buttoned and her mind racing through emergency procedures she'd practiced 100 times in simulations but never in real life. The main reactor display showed temperatures climbing in sectors 3 and 7, coolant pressure dropping across multiple systems, and a cascade failure beginning in the primary loop that could lead to a complete shutdown if they didn't get it under control immediately. Chen started barking orders, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. sending technicians to manually check valves and verify sensor readings because sometimes the instruments lied and you needed human eyes to confirm what was really happening. Tyler burst into the control room 60 seconds behind Chen, his heart hammering with a mixture of adrenaline and excitement because this was it. This was the moment where he'd prove himself under pressure like he'd always known he could. He'd been studying reactor systems obsessively for the past week, convinced that understanding the carrier's power plant would fast-track him to engineering qualifications and impress the officers who decided who got promoted and who stayed at the bottom of the ladder. "Where do you need me?" he shouted over the alarms, already moving toward the main control panel like he belonged there, his fingers hovering over buttons he'd only read about in manuals. Chen barely glanced at him before snapping, "Stay back and don't touch anything unless I tell you to." Her attention focused on the scrolling data that showed the reactor was going into an emergency shutdown sequence, an automatic safety protocol that would kill all power to the carrier's propulsion systems and leave them dead in the water until they could restart. The problem was that emergency shutdowns on nuclear carriers weren't like rebooting your computer. They involved complex procedures that took hours or even days, and the Lincoln was currently 300 miles from the nearest land in waters that weren't exactly friendly to disabled American warships. The temperature in the control room was rising, both from the stress and from the actual heat bleeding through the bulkheads from the reactor spaces below, and sweat started to bead on Chen's forehead as she coordinated with her team. Tyler watched the experienced sailors move with urgent precision, following protocols he only partially understood, and for the first time since boarding the carrier he felt a cold spike of doubt pierce his confidence. This wasn't like the simulations where everything had clear solutions and you could pause to think. This was real and fast, and the consequences of getting it wrong were catastrophic in ways his imagination couldn't quite process. At the 0351 hours, the main reactor scrambled completely, all control rods slamming into place and shutting down the nuclear reaction with the kind of violent finality that made the entire ship shudder. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red, and the background hum that every sailor had learned to tune out suddenly went silent in a way that was more deafening than any alarm. The silence was the worst part because a carrier should never be silent. It should pulse with power and purpose, and the constant background roar of systems keeping 5,000 people alive in the middle of an ocean that would kill them without hesitation. Within minutes of the scram, backup generators kicked in to provide minimal power for life support and critical systems, but it was like going from a roaring lion to a sick kitten, barely enough to keep the lights on, and definitely not enough to move the massive ship or operate most of its defensive systems. Captain Raymond Morse stood on the bridge in the emergency lighting, his jaw tight as he received reports from every department confirming what he already knew. They were dead in the water and completely vulnerable. The tactical situation was bad enough on its own, but what made it genuinely terrifying was their current position, just outside international waters in a region where Chinese and Russian vessels regularly conducted research operations that looked suspiciously like surveillance and harassment of American naval assets. A disabled carrier was the kind of prize that could turn into an international incident, or worse, and Morse knew that every radar system within 200 miles had probably just noticed that the Lincoln had stopped moving and would be sending ships to investigate. Down in the reactor space, Chen's team was already running diagnostics and trying to determine exactly what had failed and how long it would take to fix, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they crawled through access tunnels and checked systems by hand, because the computer displays were useless without full power. The preliminary assessment was grim because multiple systems had failed simultaneously in a cascade that shouldn't have been possible according to any of the failure mode analyses, suggesting either catastrophic equipment breakdown or sabotage, neither of which were comforting options. Chen stood in front of the dead reactor control panel with Martinez beside her, both of them running through restart procedures in their heads, and coming up against the same problem. They needed specific parts that weren't in their onboard inventory, and they needed diagnostic equipment that required more power than the backup generators could provide. "We're looking at 48 to 72 hours minimum," Martinez said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of engineering experience. "That's assuming the supply ship can reach us with replacement parts and assuming we don't find any other damaged systems once we start the restart sequence." Chen nodded grimly because 72 hours was an eternity when you were a sitting duck, and the odds of finding additional problems were higher than she wanted to admit. Tyler had followed them down to the reactor lab partly because he wanted to help and partly because staying in his rack while everyone else was working felt cowardly, but mostly because he still believed he could contribute something meaningful despite the growing evidence that he was out of his depth. He stood at the edge of the team, trying to understand the technical discussions flying between the experienced engineers, but feeling like they were speaking a foreign language he'd only half learned from a phrasebook. Walsh appeared in the reactor space at 0445 hours, moving through the emergency lighting with the same unhurried pace he always maintained, his mop bucket replaced by a toolbox that looked older than Tyler. Nobody had called him, nobody had assigned him to the emergency response team, but he showed up anyway because he'd been showing up to work on this carrier longer than most of the current crew had been alive. Chen glanced at him briefly, recognized him as one of the civilian contractors who did maintenance work, and immediately dismissed him from her attention because she had bigger problems than an old janitor wandering around her crisis. Walsh moved to one of the secondary control panels, the kind that monitored backup systems and coolant loops that weren't part of the main reactor operation, and started checking readings with a small handheld meter he pulled from his toolbox. Tyler watched him with barely concealed irritation because having civilians in the reactor spaces during an emergency seemed like a safety violation, and the old man's slow, methodical approach felt almost disrespectful when everyone else was moving with urgent intensity. Walsh finished his readings and approached Chen with the kind of careful respect that comes from decades of dealing with military officers who outranked civilian contractors, regardless of technical expertise. "Lieutenant Commander," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of not using it much. "I think I know what caused the cascade failure." Chen turned toward him with barely concealed impatience because she had 3 engineers pulling data logs and 2 more running physical inspections, and the last thing she needed was input from the maintenance guy who normally spent his time cleaning floors and replacing light bulbs. "Mr. Walsh, I appreciate your concern, but we have qualified personnel handling the diagnosis," she said in the tone of someone trying to be polite, while making it clear the conversation was over. "This isn't a maintenance issue, it's a complex system failure that requires specialized knowledge." Walsh nodded slowly, accepting the dismissal with the same patient resignation Tyler had seen on his face earlier, but before he could turn away, he added, "The secondary coolant pump on loop B has been vibrating incorrectly for 3 days. I filed a report about it, but nobody followed up, and I think the bearing finally seized, which caused the pressure drop that triggered everything else." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Chen's expression hardened, because she definitely didn't have time for guesswork from civilians who thought they understood nuclear engineering based on 40 years of janitorial work. "We'll check all the systems systematically using proper diagnostic protocols," she said firmly. "Please return to your regular duties and stay out of the restricted areas, unless specifically requested." Tyler actually agreed with Chen's dismissal because Walsh's theory sounded simplistic, the kind of explanation someone who didn't understand complex systems would offer, reducing a multi-system failure to a single mechanical problem like the whole thing was just a broken car that needed a new part. He'd read enough about reactor operations to know that cascade failures involved interactions between multiple systems and couldn't be traced to something as mundane as a pump bearing, and the old man's confidence in his diagnosis felt like the kind of stubborn certainty that came from not knowing enough to realize how complicated things really were. Walsh left without argument, taking his toolbox and his ignored warning back to whatever corner of the ship he normally occupied, and Chen returned to coordinating her team with the focus of someone who had real problems to solve. Over the next 6 hours, the diagnostic process moved forward with agonizing slowness, because every system check required manual verification, and every test demanded power they could barely spare from the strained backup generators. Martinez and his senior technicians traced the cascade through sensor logs and physical inspections, building a picture of how the failure had propagated through the reactor's safety systems like dominoes falling in a pattern that shouldn't have been possible. The secondary coolant pump Walsh had mentioned came up on their checklist eventually, but by that point they'd already identified 3 other potential failure points, and the pump seemed like a minor component in a much larger systemic breakdown. Tyler tried to make himself useful by running messages between departments and fetching technical manuals that the engineers requested, but mostly he felt like he was in the way, watching people who actually knew what they were doing work on problems he couldn't solve. The hours crawled past with the carrier drifting slowly on the current, its usual protective screen of escort vessels maintaining a defensive perimeter, while the command staff tried to downplay the situation in their communications with Pacific Fleet headquarters. By noon, Chen had a preliminary report ready for Captain Morse that confirmed his worst fears because they'd need parts fabricated at a shore facility and flown out by helicopter. Assuming the weather cooperated and assuming they could get the bureaucratic approvals to rush the manufacturing through channels that normally took weeks. Best case scenario is 5 days, Chen told the captain in his wardroom, her exhaustion showing through the professional composure. Worst case is 2 weeks if we encounter complications during the restart sequence. Morse absorbed this information with the stoic expression of a commander who'd just been told his ship would be vulnerable for longer than any captain wanted to contemplate, knowing that every hour increased the risk of an incident that could escalate beyond his control. The Chinese research vessel appeared on radar at 1800 hours, positioned exactly at the edge of international waters with the kind of precise navigation that suggested they knew exactly where the boundaries were and exactly what they were doing. It was joined 6 hours later by a Russian auxiliary ship that claimed to be conducting oceanographic surveys in the area, both vessels maintaining their legal right to be there, while also making it abundantly clear they were watching the disabled American carrier with great interest. The situation was technically peaceful but felt like standing in a room with loaded guns pointed at your head, everyone smiling politely while calculating angles and distances. Captain Morse convened an emergency meeting of his senior staff at 200 hours, bringing together department heads who were already running on coffee and adrenaline to discuss options that ranged from bad to worse. The engineering assessment hadn't improved because Martinez's team had discovered additional damage to coolant systems that meant even getting the parts wouldn't guarantee a successful restart, and the timeline had quietly stretched from 5 days to 7 or possibly longer. "We could request a tow from one of the escort vessels," suggested Commander Peterson, the operations officer who coordinated fleet movements. "Get us back to friendly waters where we're not sitting ducks." Morse shook his head because towing a carrier required specialized equipment that the destroyers didn't have, and even if they could rig something, it would take days to move the massive ship at the kind of crawling pace that would make them even more vulnerable than staying put. The better option was to maintain position with their defensive screen active and pray that nothing happened while they worked to fix the reactor, but prayer wasn't a tactical doctrine that Morse particularly trusted. Down in the reactor spaces, Chen's team was working rotating shifts to manually check every system and component, building a comprehensive map of the damage that seemed to grow more extensive with each new discovery. Tyler had joined one of the inspection teams, crawling through access tunnels with a flashlight clenched in his teeth and a checklist in his hands, trying to redeem himself by being useful even in the most basic ways. The work was hot and cramped and exhausting, and it stripped away the last remnants of his cocky confidence by showing him exactly how little he understood about the ship's actual operation. He found Walsh in one of the auxiliary equipment rooms at 4:30 hours, the old man sitting on an overturned bucket and eating a sandwich with the unhurried pace of someone who'd learned to take meals whenever they came. Tyler almost kept walking because he had nothing to say to the janitor and he was exhausted enough that making small talk felt impossible, but something about the old man's calm presence in the middle of the chaos made him stop. "How can you just sit there eating?" Tyler asked, his voice sharper than he intended because he was tired and scared and frustrated. "The whole ship's falling apart and you're acting like it's just another day." Walsh looked at him with those weathered eyes that had seen decades of young sailors come and go, and something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation or one like it. "Been through worse," he said simply, taking another bite of his sandwich. "Seen carriers lose power before, seen reactors scram for real reasons and false alarms, seen emergencies that turned out to be nothing and routine operations that turned into disasters. And sitting here eating doesn't make the problems any bigger or smaller, just keeps me ready to work when they need me." Tyler felt his frustration spike because the old man's calm acceptance felt like indifference, like he didn't care that they were in genuine danger. "They don't need you," he said coldly. "You're not an engineer, you're not qualified to work on nuclear systems. You're just maintenance staff who thinks 40 years of mopping floors makes you an expert." Walsh finished his sandwich before responding, his expression unchanging in a way that suggested he'd heard variations of this speech before from younger men who confused credentials with capability. "You're probably right," he said mildly, standing up and picking up his toolbox. "Good luck with your repairs, Seaman," Recruit Jennings. The breakthrough came at 0847 hours on the third day when Chen's exhaustive diagnostics finally traced the cascade back to its origin point and discovered that Walsh had been exactly right about the secondary coolant pump bearing. The failure had been progressive over several days, creating vibrations that threw off sensor calibrations and caused the automated systems to misinterpret normal operations as emergency conditions, triggering the scram that shouldn't have happened. The discovery was both vindicating and infuriating because if they'd listened to Walsh's initial report, they might have prevented the entire crisis with a simple bearing replacement that would have taken 20 minutes. Chen stared at the diagnostic report with a mixture of professional embarrassment and growing respect for the old man's instincts, realizing that she'd dismissed expertise that came from experience rather than certifications. The problem was that knowing what had caused the scram didn't actually solve their current crisis because the reactor was still dead, and they still needed parts that wouldn't arrive for at least 4 more days. Assuming the supply chain didn't encounter delays, Martinez gathered his senior engineers to discuss restart options and keep coming back to the same fundamental problem, which was that the standard restart procedure required diagnostic systems that needed more power than they could generate from backups, creating a circular dependency that seemed impossible to break. "What if we bypass the diagnostic requirements and do a manual restart?" suggested one of the younger engineers, immediately receiving skeptical looks from the veterans who knew that manual reactor startups hadn't been done on carriers since the 1970s and were considered dangerously obsolete for good reasons. Chen was about to dismiss the idea when Walsh appeared in the doorway of the control room, having apparently heard about their discussion through the mysterious information network that connected all the working-level people on a ship. "I've done manual startups before," he said quietly, his presence drawing surprised looks from the engineering team who'd forgotten he existed. "Back on the Enterprise in '79 when we had a similar power failure off the Philippines. Walked through the whole sequence by hand with the chief engineer talking me through every step. Took 6 hours, but we got her running without any fancy computers telling us what to do." The room went silent because the USS Enterprise had been the first nuclear carrier, and Walsh had apparently served on it during an era when the technology was still being figured out through trial and error by people who couldn't rely on automated systems. Chen did the math quickly in her head, and realized that if Walsh had been on the Enterprise in 1979, he would have been in his early 20s, meaning he was now in his late 60s, and had spent more than 40 years around nuclear carriers in various capacities that probably weren't all janitorial. "What was your rating when you served?" she asked carefully, suddenly seeing the old man in a completely different light. "Machinists make nuclear, qualified engineering watch supervisor," Walsh replied. "Did 26 years active duty before retiring and another 15 as a civilian contractor doing maintenance work because sitting at home felt wrong, and I've probably spent more time in reactor spaces than everyone in this room combined, even if my security clearance is expired and my certifications aren't current anymore." Tyler felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized he'd been dismissing a former nuclear engineering supervisor as an ignorant janitor, projecting his own shallow understanding onto someone who'd forgotten more about carriers than Tyler had ever learned. Chen looked at Walsh with new respect mixed with desperate calculation because manual startups were risky and using an elderly civilian contractor with expired certifications violated about 17 different regulations. But sitting dead in the water for another 4 days, while foreign vessels circled them, violated the fundamental principle of keeping your ship operational. "Talk me through what you'd need to do," she said, making it clear this was a theoretical discussion and not yet an actual plan. What followed was 2 hours of intense technical discussion, where Walsh walked Chen and Martinez through every step of a manual reactor startup sequence, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard and explaining the physics and engineering with the kind of deep understanding that only comes from hands-on experience with systems in their most basic operational state. He knew which gauges were actually important and which ones were redundant safety indicators, knew the sounds the equipment should make at each stage, and what the warning signs of problems were before instruments could measure them, knew the timing and sequences in ways that went beyond what any manual could teach. Chen asked probing questions designed to test his knowledge and kept getting answers that demonstrated Walsh understood not just the procedures, but the underlying reasons why things had to be done in specific ways. By 1100 hours they had a plan that was either brilliant or insane depending on your perspective, and Chen took it to Captain Morse with full awareness that she was asking him to stake his career and possibly the safety of his ship on the expertise of an elderly civilian contractor who officially wasn't qualified to touch anything in the reactor spaces. Morse listened to the proposal with his characteristic poker face, asked several sharp questions that showed he understood the technical challenges and the regulatory violations they'd be committing, and then made the kind of command decision that separated good captains from mediocre ones. "Make it happen," he said simply. "But Chen, if anything goes wrong during this startup, it's on both of us, and we'll have a lot of explaining to do to people who care more about procedures than results." The manual startup began at 1300 hours with Walsh and Chen in the reactor control room surrounded by every qualified nuclear technician on the ship, all of them watching with a mixture of fascination and anxiety as the old man's weathered hands moved over controls with practiced confidence. Tyler was there too, officially as a runner to fetch equipment, but really because he couldn't stand to be anywhere else after his earlier dismissal of the man who was now potentially saving the ship. Walsh worked slowly and methodically, explaining each step to Chen, so she could verify his actions against her own understanding of reactor operations, creating a collaborative process that respected both his experience and her authority. He checked temperatures and pressures manually with old-fashioned gauges that most of the younger sailors didn't even know existed, feeling for vibrations in the equipment with his hands pressed against metal surfaces and listening to the sounds of pumps and coolant flow like a mechanic listening to an engine. The startup sequence progressed through stages that had names like approach to criticality and intermediate range monitoring that meant pulling control rods in precise increments and watching for the neutron flux to increase at predicted rates, all done by hand with calculations performed on paper because the automated system still didn't have enough power to function. 2 hours into the process, a pump started making an irregular sound that Walsh immediately identified as a warning sign, catching a problem that would have been missed by the automated systems and preventing another cascade failure before it could begin. Tyler watched him work with growing awe because this was real expertise, not the kind you got from memorizing manuals but the kind you earned through decades of direct experience with the actual machinery, and he felt his earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of genuine competence. At 47 hours, the main reactor achieved sustainable criticality and began generating power that flowed through the carrier's electrical systems like life returning to a patient who'd been on life support, and the background hum that defined a carrier's normal operations slowly built back to its familiar reassuring roar. The USS Abraham Lincoln resumed normal operations at 1800 hours, with all systems functioning within normal parameters, and Captain Morse immediately ordered the ship to make full speed back to friendly waters, while they still had the chance. The Chinese and Russian vessels maintained their surveillance positions for another 6 hours before finally breaking off and returning to their respective patrol areas, having apparently decided that a fully operational American carrier wasn't worth the continued attention. Down in the reactor spaces, Walsh finished his post-startup checks and prepared to return to his normal maintenance duties as if he'd done nothing more remarkable than fix a leaky pipe. Chen stopped him before he could leave, her expression showing a mixture of gratitude and professional respect that transcended rank and credentials. "Mr. Walsh, I owe you an apology for dismissing your initial warning about the pump bearing," she said formally. "Your expertise and experience saved this ship, and I'll be recommending to the captain that your contributions be officially recognized." Walsh nodded his acceptance of the apology with the same patient dignity he'd shown when being dismissed, understanding that Chen had been following protocols and training that emphasized credentials over experience. "No offense taken, Lieutenant Commander," he said quietly. "You had a crisis to manage and 100 voices telling you different things, and trusting an old civilian contractor probably wasn't high on your priority list. but maybe next time somebody with 40 years of experience mentions something's wrong, it might be worth at least checking before things go critical. Tyler found Walsh on the hangar deck at 2000 hours, the old man back in his regular coveralls, and pushing his mop bucket across the same section of deck where Tyler had first dismissed him 3 days and a lifetime of lessons ago. He approached with genuine humility, replacing the cocky confidence that had defined his first weeks on the carrier, understanding now that he knew almost nothing about the Navy or ships or life despite his test scores and manual memorization. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, "I was wrong about you, about everything really, and I wanted to apologize for the things I said and the way I treated you like you didn't matter." Walsh stopped mopping and looked at Tyler with those weathered eyes that had seen generations of young sailors learn this same lesson in various ways. "Apology accepted, son," he said with a slight smile that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "You've got potential and good instincts underneath all that pride, and the fact that you're standing here apologizing means you learned something important about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between credentials and competence, between what the manuals tell you and what experience teaches you." They talked for an hour on that hangar deck while the carrier cut through Pacific waters under its own power again, Walsh sharing stories from his decades of service that illustrated lessons about humility and respect, and the importance of listening to people regardless of their rank or position. Tyler learned that Walsh had worked on 7 different carriers, had trained hundreds of young engineers during his active duty years, had chosen to stay in the Navy as a civilian contractor because the work gave his life meaning, even when it meant people treated him like an invisible maintenance worker. He learned that expertise comes in many forms and that the person you dismiss as unimportant might be the one who saves your life when everything goes wrong. Over the following weeks, Tyler's attitude transformed as he sought out the older sailors and civilian contractors who actually kept the carrier running, learning from their experience and treating them with the respect they'd earned through decades of service. He studied harder, but with humility now, understanding that technical knowledge was just the foundation and real competence required years of practical application. Walsh continued his maintenance work with the same quiet efficiency, occasionally being consulted by engineering teams who'd learned to value his insights, and Tyler made a point of helping him whenever possible, because working alongside someone who truly understood the ship taught him more than any manual ever could. The story of how an ignored mechanic had restarted the carrier's dead reactor spread through the fleet with the kind of embellishment that turns real events into legend. But the core truth remained unchanged, because Walsh had demonstrated that experience and expertise deserved respect regardless of uniforms or credentials. Captain Morse submitted Walsh's name for a civilian service commendation that recognized his critical contribution to saving the ship, and the ceremony where he received it was attended by the entire engineering department and a young seaman recruit who'd learned that true competence speaks softly and carries the weight of decades. Tyler stood at attention during that ceremony with tears in his eyes because he understood now what he'd been too proud to see before, that every person on the carrier mattered, that dismissing people based on appearances or positions was not just wrong but dangerous, that the measure of a person came from their actions and character rather than their rank or credential. The Pacific stretched endlessly around them as the USS Abraham Lincoln continued its mission, powered by a reactor that an old man with expired certifications had brought back to life through sheer expertise and the kind of stubborn competence that refuses to be diminished by being ignored.